So we're continuing with the lecture on Chapter 12, talking about arts of ritual and daily life. And I want to introduce you all to a fine artist called Alawe of Ise. He was the artist of kings and holy men, born near the holy city of Yoruba in Nigeria. Now, the Yoruba culture was very advanced and very sophisticated, with a strong spiritual base that it got somewhat disrupted during the slave trade with the West, but it is still considered to be the great seat of culture in the African tradition. Now, this guy, Alawe of Ise, he was revered in his time in Africa. And I'd like to invite you all to look at the image that's on page 270 and to read the little biography about him on page 271. But in particular, here we're looking at posts in a palace that he carved. But what's interesting about him is that his work was presented at an expo in England, but it wasn't credited to him. It was credited to an unknown African artist. Although, you know what? If anyone would have asked, he was famous in Africa. Just nobody asked. That's an interesting kind of study about colonialism, the attitudes of the day. But here, I want you to look at the bottom of page 270 on the right side. Now, here we have a close-up of that little face that you see down there. So this guy was kind of, I wouldn't say he was showing off. I'd say he was exhibiting his skill because he carved the face, which bounces around in there. It's a ball that's freestanding. It is not attached. And he carved it inside of the sculpture. So there you have a little bit of an example of his skill level. All right, let's move on to talk about fiber. Now, fiber is a subject that I could probably talk about for the entire session, but will restrain myself because it's something that personally I've worked with quite a bit. Fiber is defined as a pliable thread-like strand, but we're going to also talk about surface design, which is painting on the surface of fabric, or we also have basketry. Now, let's talk first about basketry. Here we have a historic photo from traditional pomo basket weavers. And in basket weaving, there's a whole ritual to it. Traditionally, it was done by women, but men also do that tradition now. But to weave the basket, you first have to go harvest the reeds or the willow strands to make the basket. And then typically they're soaked until they become quite pliable, and then the baskets are woven. Now let's look at another historic photo of a collection of baskets from the pomo tradition. And as it does say in the textbook, often symbols or objects, fibers were included that had a ritual or spiritual significance. So now let's talk about textiles, like as a fiber art, as in clothing that we wear. Now, the earliest textiles were probably felt, where you would take raw fleece from the sheep and pound and dampen it until it becomes a flat, solid mass. Weaving is also an ancient form that we still use to this day to create fabric. Let's talk about some looms. This one is so great, and I'm not sure if any of you have, there might be some of you that have not ever heard of a backstrap loom, but it's such a wonderful and efficient kind of loom. When you look at woven work from Guatemala, Central America, well, actually they had these looms all over the world. But if you see these kind of strips of woven fabric that have been attached together along the sides, it may have come from this kind of a loom. Now, if you can look carefully, there's actually a strap that goes behind the woman around her hips that creates the tension, and then the other end of the loom is attached to a tree. So these are really handy. I mean, you can just set up your loom anywhere. Now, on the other hand, we also have what would be called a floor loom, a large loom, which is what we see here. Now, I've worked with that quite a bit, and weaving is a wonderful process, but part of the weaving is creating the warp thread. You create all the strings that you weave through, the white strings in this case, and that's a very delicate and refined process. So what comes before weaving? We have spinning. You know, I just included it because it's a beautiful photograph, and there's something so ancient about spinning, as people have been spinning fabric for just tens of thousands of years. I don't know if any of you have ever tried it. It's pretty tricky. And this is a traditional East Indian spinning setup. So moving on along, let's talk about Incan textiles. Now, the textile artists from the Incan tradition were extremely skilled at their art. And let's look at this same one that is in your book. This would be a coat that a king would wear, and it's on page, or tunic they call it, page 273. And in this case you could see all these little squares were attached together, and it's probably in two pieces, split down the middle, and then sewn together. So this is an example. This is an ancient piece. It actually dates from around 1500. So it's survived all this time, and it shows their great skill at weaving. I'm going to talk a little bit about surface design. Here what we're looking at is a batik artist, and this is sort of on the fringe of fiber art, but it's definitely art, and this is typically done in Bali, Indonesia. They also do batik in the ancient Egyptians did it with beeswax. So in this process, the artist is painting melted wax onto the fabric, and anywhere that the wax goes, the color or the fabric dye will not go. It's a resist process. So the artist will build up layers of wax and dye. In this instance, the next step would be to dye colors. Now sometimes the dye is painted on, sometimes the whole thing is dipped in a bucket of dye. Both are valid techniques. So once that had dried, the artist would go back through, so let's say the next color has been applied, and apply more wax, more dye, more wax, etc. When it's all full of wax, they crack it up and make cracks in the wax and rub dye into it. Now why am I going on and on about this? Well, this is a medium that I learned when I was 12 years old, and this is a piece by your instructor here that I did not too long ago, a couple of months ago. And in this piece you can see that it's the wax has been kind of cracked here. Now I have melted the wax out. That's the final step. But this is all painted with wax and dye on cotton fabric. So is it fine art? Is it craft? Well, that's an eternal question that can never really be answered. But I thought I would share with you one of my favorite fiber arts. So, you know, the ancient Persians, people from the Middle East, were very famous for their rug design. And these are extraordinary because there's literally millions of little knotted pieces of thread that have been knotted to a prepared woven surface. So this one, let's see, this rug is pretty old. I believe it's from about 1500, this one that we're looking at here. And there's a very famous example in your book that is from 1539 and 40. So there's another example of textiles that makes the bridge between fine art and functionality. Often these were hung on the walls, definitely no shoes on the rug, so they were appreciated as art in themselves. Alright, so up to now we've been talking about art that was created from pretty simple means in a certain way. In other words, cloth, clay, which is essentially mud, glass, which is sand, and some kind of a binder like potash. Well, now let's talk about the precious kind of objects. So, to begin with, let's take a look at ivory. Now, ivory is created from the tusks of an animal, or the teeth of an animal, large animal. Traditionally, this would have been an elephant or a walrus. There's a few other, maybe some hippo teeth were used also. Now, elephants represented royalty, longevity, and wisdom. They were really highly prized in ancient Africa. And as a result, their tusks were used for materials that were turned into these beautiful objects. Now this, I don't think this particular one was an armband. This might have been the head to a staff. Whatever it was used probably by royalty, because it was royalty that were allowed to use objects made of ivory. Now, there seemed to be a pretty good balance in ancient times, but once ivory became popular in Europe and beyond, then it became much sought after, and elephants were hunted almost to extinction. So this is a fine example of ivory, although ivory trade is virtually illegal today. Next up we have jade. Now jade is a fine and precious stone. You can find it in East and Central Asia and in Central America. It comes in a range of colors, but was really valued by all of these cultures in Central America and especially in Chinese and Japanese traditions. Jade is seen to connote both a softness and a strength. They say it's the softest and the hardest stone of all. Now this is an ancient piece from China, and it depicts a dragon, which is supposed to have sort of mythical properties. Now we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about lacquer. Now, lacquer is made from the sap of the cashew tree, which originally only grew in China. It's brushed in thin coats, as many as 30 coats per object, to build up a layer, this clear, hard layer. Now the Japanese, they specialized in inlay. So they would use inlay on these fine wooden boxes and other objects, and then use the lacquer also. So they were masters of that. Although this example is from ancient China. Now after there was this great split between fine art and craft in the 1700s, arts such as ceramic, furniture, making textiles and such were given various names. Decorative arts, applied arts, craft. And all these seem to infer that they were a little bit of a lesser art than the fine arts. So as the Industrial Revolution took off and everything began to be made in mass quantities, there was sort of a rebellion. And people felt like there was something that was going to be lost if we didn't hang on to this rich tradition of fine craft. So there was different workshops were set up in order to preserve that tradition. And here's one fine example from the artist Gustav Stickley. This is a Stickley box, and I want you to notice how finely it is crafted. Now there were several other artists that kind of bridged the gap between art and fine craft, and one of them is the artist Gail Chihuly, who we see here. Now he's a very famous glass artist, and his objects are really more, this is a collection of his work, this is him at work. And his objects are really more about, they're fine art, and they're used in large buildings. You know, he's a very well-known artist for the glass itself rather than glass as a vessel. Another artist who's done the same in furniture would be Judy Kensley Mackay. She's a very famous furniture maker. There's an example in the book, and here's another example of her work. Now here we have a wonderful artist, El Antui, and he is featured in one of your films this week. Now when you look at this magnificent thing, it's really important to remember that it's made of bottle caps and sardine cans. So El Antui, he would employ maybe over a dozen workmen in his workshop to create these fine installations, these fine pieces that were really based on the traditional kente cloth, which was the garment worn by royalty in ancient Africa. So we're winding up our little look at the art of ritual and daily life, but I want to end with one that's very modern. This is made from a 3D printer. There's another example at the end of your chapter that's the same kind of technique. And now I found this one very interesting because the artist is sort of melding traditions. It looks Art Nouveau in a way. It looks like it's from the early 20th century, and at the same time it's made from a 3D printer. I don't know how I feel about that. I like the idea of the artist using their hands to create a work. And yet this technology can be really useful in a lot of applications. So this probably presents, I would say this presents yet another paradox in the world of art, which is it art or is it craft? Is it better to make it with the hands or to let machines do the work? And I'd say that each of us has to kind of come to our answer or no answer.